listeners, and welcome back to the SKYLIT Books podcast series. I'm your host for this episode, Justin Remer, and you're here for another SKYLIT author interview. Today I'm here with Ted Adams, the author of The Ultimates in Exploration. It's part of the Marvel Age of Comics series from Marvel and Bloomsbury. We've had a couple of authors in this series before. Hopefully you enjoyed those episodes. Hopefully you'll enjoy what we've got for us today. I was talking to Ted before, and we were talking about how it might be nice to set the scene with one of the early chapters in the book. So thanks for being here, Ted, and tell us what you're going to read.
Okay. Thanks, Justin. I appreciate you offering me this opportunity to introduce people to my book. And I'm going to read a chapter, my chapter 2, which I titled The Road to the Ultimate Universe. And I thought this might be good because it kind of sets the stage for what the comic book business was like before the Ultimate Universe started. And so I'm going to give you a good sense of that. I will give you the caveat that I used to read to my son every night from literally almost the day he was born until he was about 11 years old. I definitely was, I was reading to him even at a point where he's like, "Dad, come on, I don't want you to read to me anymore." So I do have a lot of experience reading aloud because I did it literally for almost 11 years. But he's 22 now, so it has been some time. So I don't know if my reading voice is up to par, but we'll give it a shot here. So like I said, this is chapter 2 called The Road to the Ultimate Universe. When the 1990s started, comic book sales were booming. Spider-Man #1 by Todd McFarlane sold more than 2 million copies in 1990. And was available with different covers that included gold, silver, and platinum versions, and also came both polybagged and not polybagged. That huge number was shattered just a year later by Chris Claremont and Jim Lee with X-Men #1, which sold more than 8 million copies and had 4 different covers that, when placed together, made one large image. Claremont and Lee's sales record actually still stands today and is recognized by the Guinness World Records as the best-selling comic single edition. So this was a time when comic book publishers and retailers were benefiting from customers who were buying comic books as an investment. These speculators would buy multiple copies of the hot titles as if they were investing in the stock market. To further entice these new customers, publishers tried new things that excited fans. In 1991, The Incredible Hulk number 377 was printed with bright green Dayglow inks and saw its sales skyrocket. Seeing how well that worked, Silver Surfer number 50 was printed with a logo and the character embossed on the cover with a shiny silver foil. And Ghost Rider number 15 showcased the character's flaming head printed with glow-in-the-dark ink. Fan-focused magazines like Wizard and Hero Illustrated helped feed the frenzy by featuring monthly price guides and endless lists of the new hot comic books and creators. Wizard's second issue was dated October 1991, and the top 10 hottest books were all Marvel titles, with X-Men #1 taking the top spot and Spider-Man #1 coming in at the number 6 spot. Around the same time that X-Men #1 was hitting comic shops, Marvel Entertainment Group became a public company under the ticker symbol MVL. The stock price almost immediately doubled, and the company's financial future looked golden. But some creative and business struggles, combined with an industry-wide decline in sales that saw 20% of comic book shops going out of business in 1993 alone, meant that the financial results weren't looking great for Marvel. When things didn't improve, Marvel filed for bankruptcy in 1996. But the type of bankruptcy Marvel filed didn't mean the company was going out of business. They were able to restructure their finances and keep publishing, even during this difficult period. Before filing for bankruptcy in 1996, for the first time in its history, Marvel rebooted several of their characters in a storyline known as Heroes Reborn. While it wasn't marketed as a separate imprint, this reimagining of core Marvel characters would act as a precedent for the Ultimate line. The publishing plan saw Jim Lee and his Wildstorm production studio take on Fantastic Four and Iron Man, while Rob Liefeld and his Extreme Studios tackled Captain America and the Avengers. I was actually working for Wildstorm when these comic books were created, and remember the palpable excitement in the office when they were being worked on. Getting to see an early view of Jim's take on these classic Marvel characters is one of the highlights of my career. This was also the era when collectible card games, known as CCGs, first became popular, and the team I managed at Wildstorm was responsible for the Wildstorm's CCG. As the title implies, it focused on characters in the Wildstorm universe, but because of Heroes Reborn, Marvel allowed us to include the Fantastic Four and Iron Man on some of our cards. For a lifelong Marvel fan like me, it was fun to be able to briefly work on their characters. In the Liefeld-produced comics, the Heroes Reborn Avengers team was led by Captain America, with the other members including Thor, Vision, Scarlet Witch, Hellcat, Hawkeye, and Swordsman. Only a couple of these characters would overlap with the Ultimates lineup, but one plot point would be resurrected. In the Heroes Reborn reboot, Nick Fury and S.H.I.E.L.D. directed the actions of the team. Sales were initially strong for the relaunched titles, but the experiment only lasted a year. By the time Heroes Reborn ended, sales for Marvel and every other comic book publisher were down significantly from the salad days of X-Men #1. The total number of comic books ordered in January 1990 was over 10 million. By the end of 1999, sales had plummeted to almost half that number. Before the entire comic book industry started to contract, Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti, two popular comic book artists, started their own publishing company, Event Comics, in 1994. Before starting Event Comics, Quesada was a penciler who worked on a handful of titles for Valiant, DC, and Marvel. Palmiotti was an inker who worked on Marvel titles, including The Punisher, Ghost Rider, and Marvel Comics Presents. They'd worked together on a number of comic book covers. While Quesada and Palmiotti were getting Event off the ground, the characters from Heroes Reborn were returned to regular Marvel continuity with the aptly titled storyline Heroes Return, and senior management at Marvel was looking to replicate the success they'd initially seen with those comics. The president of Marvel Comics, Joe Calamari, was impressed by what Quesada and Palmiotti were doing at Event and approached the pair in 1998 about overseeing a handful of titles, an imprint that would be known as Marvel Knights. Quesada spoke about the state of the comic book industry during the period when he and Palmiotti were asked to start Marvel Knights. He said, "You have to frame it under the umbrella of what the comic book world was going through at this point. We were on the edge of extinction, and you really got the sense, or we really got the sense, from hanging out with people at Marvel, because they were seeing the sales figures come in, and they weren't just watching sales drop, they were watching stores cease to exist. I mean, like franchises gone, hundreds and hundreds of stores closing, distributors closing." That's the end of the quote from Quesada. Like the deal Marvel did with Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld for Heroes Reborn, Quesada and Palmiotti, with Nancy Dikisian, would handle all editorial responsibilities for the titles they were given. But instead of working remotely, both Lee and Liefeld produced their Heroes Reborn titles from their studios in California. The Marvel's Knights team would have offices at Marvel's New York City headquarters, albeit on a different floor from the rest of the company. The four titles in the Marvel Knights line were Daredevil, Black Panther, Inhuman, and Punisher. Unlike the Heroes Reborn deal, they weren't given the company's premier characters, and they weren't doing a reboot. The Marvel Knights stories would take place in Marvel's ongoing continuity. Marvel Knights was branded as an imprint within Marvel Comics, with the corner box on the cover clearly identifying the titles in the line. Throughout the 1990s, it was the artists who drove comic book sales for Marvel. The huge numbers for Spider-Man #1 and X-Men #1 were largely because of the art by Todd McFarlane and Jim Lee. When McFarlane and Lee formed Image Comics with other Marvel artists, their initial comics were equally focused on the art. When Marvel brought back Lee and Liefeld for Heroes Reborn, it was with a similar art-forward aim. It was Kevin Smith's run on Marvel Knights Daredevil where that would start to change. The fans' attention would begin to shift toward the writer and the stories they were telling. This is a trend we'll continue to see when we discuss the Ultimate line. Smith's Daredevil stories, which combine darker plots with clever dialogue that often had pop culture references, would inspire the work Mark Millar would do on the Ultimates. And that is my chapter 2.
Yeah. I mean, it's really a good setup because this is the moment where I come clean a little bit and I admit that I don't know very much about comics.
Yeah, good.
I definitely have seen the movies. And honestly, this series, The Marvel Age of Comics, from Bloomsbury and Marvel, has been great because it gives me a lot of, context that I certainly didn't have before. And I find it interesting because you do kind of set up the idea that this Ultimates version of the Avengers characters, so the Ultimates are basically Ultimate Avengers, but they didn't call it that. Yeah. Is really kind of like setting the tone and the sort of model for what became the MCU version.
Yeah, so it's interesting because so as that chapter I just read indicates, the comic business wasn't doing well at the end of the 1990s, which
Yeah.
might be surprising to people because comics now are such a pervasive part of our pop culture, right? So people like you, who didn't grow up reading comics and didn't really know comics, lots of Marvel, lots about Marvel because of all the movies and the TV shows. It's become just so much part of the cultural zeitgeist that we're all steeped in superheroes. But in the late 1990s and in the early 2000s, in 2000, 2001, when the Ultimate line started, comic sales were really not doing well. And Marvel Comics had purchased a trading card company called Fleer, which was a sports card company. And they had also purchased a company called Toy Biz, which did action figures. So they were, they were growing by acquisition. And one of the really good things that happened for them was there was a really smart guy named Bill Jemas who had worked for Fleer. And Bill Jemas was like you. He didn't grow up reading comics. He was a very smart guy. He went to Harvard Law School. Was very much an intelligent man. And so when he became president of Marvel Comics, he had a job at Fleer, and then eventually became head of Marvel Comics. He sat down and started reading the comics, and he said to himself, like, "Wow, this stuff is just incomprehensible." Because one of the things Marvel had really done was they'd been building on their continuity all the way back to Fantastic Four #1 from 1961. And so Bill Jemas was like, well, these are way too complicated. If I can't figure it out, how can an average person go into a comic store and pick up a brand new comic and have any hope of understanding it? So he worked with Joe Quesada, who had been working with Marvel, as I said in chapter 2, as part of the Marvel Knights line, to basically start this Ultimate Universe. And basically this was going to be rebooting the characters. So it was going to be starting the origin stories all over again. And the whole goal was to make it accessible to people who had never read comics before. And so the first one they did was Ultimate Spider-Man, and that was very successful. And the Spider-Man movie, the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie, came out not too long after that. And so it was almost kind of perfect, because now people who would go see this Spider-Man movie, millions and millions of people would go and see Spider-Man, and then they could go to their comic store and get Ultimate Spider-Man #1, and they wouldn't have to know 30 years of continuity, right? They could just pick up that issue. So when that was successful, they did another comic called Ultimate Marvel Team Up, which was basically Spider-Man teaming up with other characters. They did the Ultimate X-Men, so same thing where they rebooted the characters, and then eventually got to the Ultimates, which is what I write about. And as you said, the Ultimates are basically the Ultimate Avengers. They just decided not to call them that. So, and the whole idea is that it was rebooting the characters, so you didn't have to have ever read an Avengers comic in your life. You could just pick up Ultimates #1, and you were ready to go.
I know that's fascinating, because I feel like the idea of reboots, even in the cinematic version of Marvel, seems like so common, but the fact that they had gone 40 years just basically building on the same mythology and stories referring to things that happened decades ago, and it's kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah, and the cool thing is, of course, they continued to do those as well, right? So they had when they launched Ultimate Spider-Man as a brand new series, they still were publishing Amazing Spider-Man, which was dealing with all that continuity. So they really were able, both kinds of readers were satisfied, right? The long-term fan could read Amazing Spider-Man, and the brand new fan could read Ultimate Spider-Man.
Yeah. Well, I guess we should. I was going to jump ahead, but we should probably start with the creators. So Mark Millar is a name I was aware of because of Kick-Ass. I did actually read the first Kick-Ass years ago and was like, God, this is violent.
So Mark, and I have to be honest with you, I've never gotten a straight answer on if his name is Millar or Miller. It's certainly spelled Millar, but I've heard lots of people pronounce it Miller, so I pronounce it Millar. Apologies to him. I genuinely like his work, as you know, if you read my books, so I like his work, and I've worked in comics for 35 years. I should know how to pronounce his last name, but I really honestly don't. So let's go with Millar. So Mark Millar, he's from the UK. And he had been working, there's a weekly anthology in the UK called 2000 AD, a science fiction anthology primarily. It's where Judge Dredd came from, is what American audiences know it for. And so he'd been doing stories with them. He had been co-writing some comics with another very popular writer named Grant Morrison. And he had started to do U.S. comics. And he actually did a book for DC Comics called The Authority, which was a very dark take on superheroes. So he kind of had this experience doing kind of a darker take on superheroes at this DC book. And then Brian Hitch is another British artist, and he had also worked on The Authority. And so not at the same time that Mark did, but separately. And so they both had this experience doing these kind of darker versions of superhero characters. And they were at I would say it's fair to say that they were at the early stages of their career. It wasn't really the beginning of their career because they had done other work that had been popular by the time they did the Ultimates. But I think it's fair to say that the Ultimates is what really kind of put them on the map. The Ultimates #1 was the best-selling comic book of 2002. And so, it was very commercially successful. Fans really liked it. And, as you said, it would go on to be very influential for the Marvel movies. They certainly took some of their ideas from the Ultimates, certainly from the tone. And what Mark was doing specifically with the writing was it was written, I would say, for a more mature audience. And so, the stories were darker than you would typically find in a Marvel comic. He has a very sort of acerbic wit. His scripts are very funny. His characters sound like real people. So the dialogue actually sounds kind of, naturalistic. And then Brian Hitch is just this extraordinary artist. I mean, he's really, truly, I think one of the best comic book artists of all time. Has this amazing ability to do this, what I call kind of hyper detail, where the art is just really, really detailed and beautiful. And it really pays off in some of the big action sequences. We see some scenes where there's these big fights in spaceships, and the detail he draws on these spaceships and the battle scenes is really extraordinary. But he's also really good at the characterization and drawing them so that they look like people. And it's just, he's just uniquely talented. And he does this nice job. He calls it the rhythm of storytelling, where he does a mix of splash pages. So one big image on a page, and then he'll have a multi-panel page. And so it's this kind of rhythm of how the story is told. He paces it very nicely. And one of the things that Mark does is he doesn't feel like when Hitch's art is telling the story, Mark doesn't feel like he has to cover it with captions and word balloons to tell the reader what's going on. He lets Brian tell the story. And honestly, that's a little unique for comics. If you look at most comics, through the 60s all the way into this period that we're talking about, comics are filled with word balloons and captions, and many of them unnecessary because the art's actually delivering you that information. And Mark, I'm assuming, again, I haven't spoken with him, but my assumption is that he saw Brian's art and was like, I don't need to put anything on this page because the art is telling the story.
Yeah, that's interesting. I learned about, I guess, what the Marvel method or the Marvel way from Stuart Moore, because I talked to him about his Doctor Strange book, about how the writer would, I'm assuming it might be a modified version in the 2000s, but like that the writer would come up with the story, but then the artist would basically like draw it and pace it out, and then the writer would come back and add the dialogue or add the captions, like you're saying. So it is interesting that he's looking at it and he's like, I don't need to add anything to this. That's cool. And to him, kudos to him, because the writer's presence on the page are those words, and so he had the confidence to be able to say, I can be a good writer and not have my words all over the page. It's interesting. I'm reading this book. Roy Thomas, who was a very important comic book writer, and he was an editor at Marvel for a long time, a very influential person at Marvel Comics in their early days. And he just published the first part of his autobiography. It's called Roy Thomas: A Life in Four Colors, and I'm just about finished with it. And he's talking about that period that you're talking about, where Stan Lee came up with what became known as the Marvel method, which is basically he would essentially co-plot with a writer or with an artist. Sometimes I suspect not even probably the artist probably did the plotting, and then he would just come in and do the dialogue and the captions. And he's talking about how when he first started working at Marvel,
there might be a splash page, and he specifically talks about this in his book. There might be a splash page where it's a big image of Iron Man, and then there's 4 or 5 people in the background, and Stan wanted every single one of those characters to have a word balloon. So that's, so those comics are really text heavy, and he tells a story about how when he did one of his first stories, he didn't give every single character a word balloon, and Stan's like, no, you got to give every single one of those guys a word balloon. So definitely a very different kind of storytelling. Now, with that said, I don't know what method Mark and Brian used when they wrote this, or when they created this. So I don't know if Mark used the Marvel method or the full script method. If I had to guess, I would guess it probably was a full script method, but I don't know for sure. I don't know. Yeah. I've never seen one of the scripts from this series.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because obviously it probably morphed over time, but you talking about that reminded me about how, I think maybe you said in like issue 3, there's like essentially a flashback, but they literally show you a flashback image rather than the old Marvel way of having a caption is like, if you need to know what this is, go back to issue number 1. Whoever fought.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's they flash back to a scene from an Ultimate Marvel team up issue where the Hulk appears. I think it was the Hulk for the first time. And yeah, that was very, again, kind of, Mark and the editorial team at Marvel not kind of spoon feeding things in the way that they did in the 60s. And the truth is, the audience, on those early Marvel comics in the 60s and 70s, those comics were aimed very much at kids. That that's who they saw as their audience were young kids. And the Ultimates is clearly aimed at an older audience. And so they, I think the expectation is that there's going to be more maturity in the reading comprehension and just kind of, the ability to read. I don't think the Ultimates from the story and from the visual presentation, I don't think that they were aiming at the 10-year-old that the old Marvel comics were.
Yeah. I mean, I think especially maybe in this era, certainly within film, like I think there was sort of this thing of like, oh, all the action movies are getting so dark and so gritty, and especially like the Nolan Batmans, oh, they're so dark and so gritty. But like if you look at this, you're like, oh, this is the dark and gritty era. Like the art is great, but yeah, it's like it's often kind of like desaturated of color, except for like the explosions are kind of exciting and bright or whatever. This is definitely like telegraphing like this is not your candy colored kids superhero story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that point about coloring, I discussed that in the book. The colorist for most of it is a guy named Paul Mounts, and the 1990s is also the era when comics started to be colored with computers. So comic book colorists used to do it they would do color indication for color separator, and it was a very cumbersome process. And then in the 1990s, when Photoshop and Illustrator came around, comics started to be colored on the computer. So colorists would use computer coloring, creating a digital file that could then be turned into, in the early days, into film, and then into the digital printing that is typically used today. And when the computer colorists were first sort of figuring out how to use this technology, in my opinion, a lot of those particularly the early superhero comics, they're a little garish. The colors are very bright, primary colors. They're a little much for me, frankly. But with this series, Paul Mounts made the decision clearly to use a more subtle palette, and so it's not bright primary colors. It's not popping off the page, and I think that really complements Brian Hitch's art, and something else that really set this apart from other comics that were on the stands at this time. It just visually looked a lot different. The art looked different. The coloring looked different. And so, it's all these things that really, and I think all of these things are why, again, it was the best-selling comic of the year when it came out. So, it really got the attention of I think both, in this case, it got the attention of both the existing fans, and it brought in new fans as well.
I get interested in sort of like the nuts and bolts of things. Like you talk a little bit about how even the lettering of this is is different for like a superhero comic. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so comics historically have always were always done with uppercase lettering, for most of the history of comics. So if you look from Action Comics #1 all the way until more or less where this comic appeared in the early 2000s, it was always done with uppercase lettering. And Marvel superhero comics in the early part of their when they started, back in 1961. Not only being all in uppercase, but every single sentence would end with an exclamation point. Whether or not it was something that was being exclaimed or not, it ended with an exclamation point. And so this comic, and I don't know for sure that it was the first one, but it was certainly one of the first Marvel comics to be lettered both in upper and lower case. And so it read more like a traditional book, right? It didn't read not everything was screaming at you in all caps and exclamation point, right? So instead, this is again kind of more subtle. And, and it really works again because Mark's dialogue is very naturalistic. And so, I think all of these things are just kind of, again, sort of clues that they were aiming for a different audience.
You talk about how the pacing being sort of more movie-ish, but also like allowing for that naturalism.
Yeah, and really allowing for character development. It's really interesting. This is a superhero title, right? And again, I went back and reread, when I wrote the book, I went back and reread a bunch of the early Avengers comics that were done by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and some other artists. And, they are what they are. They were aimed at kids, right? So those are being created for 10-year-olds. And they're certainly very fun. In every episode, every issue, the heroes are fighting someone, and they also are bickering between each other. But every single issue has a fight scene between the Avengers and some bad guy. In the Ultimates, it's interesting. So this is a superhero team. It's a group, right? It's multiple Marvel characters. Well, in the first issue, it's pretty much just a Captain America story. And it's not only just a Captain America story, it's a Captain America story that takes place mostly in World War II. So it's like He kicks things off. And, Mark, by writing this story, basically just says, hey, this is not going to be like any other superhero team comic you've ever read. In fact, the first issue is not even the superhero team. It's just one single character. And so eventually by issue 2, the team starts to gather. But it's not until I think it's the 5th issue. I made it. It's been a minute since I read these and wrote the book. But yeah, it wasn't until the 5th issue that they actually fight someone. They get into a fight, and the person that they fight isn't even another. It's not a bad guy. It's one of their teammates. They fight the Hulk. So this is really interesting. You get the superhero team, and they're not actually fighting bad guys for the first 3-4 issues. Why is that important? Well, again, it's very different. It's a very different kind of superhero storytelling. It allows him to really develop these characters. So all of a sudden, it's not just you get to actually know these characters before they enter into ultimately what be, they eventually do have a big battle to save the world, and they fight aliens and, all the kinds of things you would expect. But they take the time to really let the reader learn about these characters. And these are, Marvel characters all the way back to Fantastic Four and the first issues of Spider-Man. The thing that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko really created was they were superhero characters that had problems, right? And so the Fantastic Four, they bickered like a real family. They weren't always heroic. Peter Parker was a science nerd who got picked on by bullies and constantly was making bad decisions. The whole idea was that they were real people. And I think, Mark and Brian really take that to a whole nother level here. These characters in the Ultimates, they feel like real people, and they make mistakes. They're not perfect. They do in some cases, they do some pretty horrific things. Honestly, the heroes do some pretty horrific things. And so, again, this is all just kind of an interesting take and a more adult, more serious take on these classic characters, something that, that a Marvel reader probably wouldn't have seen before.
It's almost like, because this is like a quarter century ago, so this is very refreshing. Yeah. But now it feels like every TV series does this, and people joke. It's like, if it's like, if it was a Silver Surfer TV series, it'd be the end of season 1. He finally gets a surfboard or something. It's
right.
But it is interesting because it's instead of there having to be a rock'em sock'em brawl in every issue, like it's really just sort of building it up. And also you talk about kind of the graphic novel compilations coming into play in this way.
Yeah.
Because it's almost like they're writing for the compilation rather than like the issue by issue.
Yeah. By the early 2000s, graphic novels and collected editions were pretty commonplace, and so writers had started to write. Some people call it deconstructed storytelling in comics, and so, for example, Ultimate Spider-Man. Just to pivot to that one for a second. So that was written by a guy named Brian Michael Bendis and drawn by Mark Bagley. And Bill Jemas actually helped plot the first part of the first Ultimate Spider-Man story arc. And it's interesting because if you look back at Spider-Man's origin story, he first appeared in a comic called Amazing Fantasy number 15. And it's a 10 or 11 page story. And it's done by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. And it's pretty astonishing because in that 11-page story, they really establish all the plot points that the general person knows about Spider-Man, right? He's a science nerd. He goes to a fair, gets bitten by a radioactive spider. He gains spider powers. He initially tries to monetize them. He has the chance to stop a bad guy, but doesn't. That bad guy then goes on to kill his Uncle Ben. And he comes up with the idea that with great power comes great responsibility, right? And so it's those plot points, more or less, that drive, hundreds of, if not all, Spider-Man stories. So it's done in 10 or 11 pages. Well, Ultimate Spider-Man told that same story, delivered essentially those same plot points, but it was over 5 or 6 issues. And so that's this idea of this deconstructed storytelling. So taking the time to really develop, because while what Stan and Steve did in Amazing Fantasy 15 is maybe the best comic story ever written, at least in my opinion. It doesn't allow for a lot of characterization, right? Because there's all this action going on in those 11 pages. But what Ultimate Spider-Man allows for is to really deep characterization to go on. So you can really, because in Amazing Fantasy 15, you don't really get a good sense of Peter Parker's relationship with his Uncle Ben, right? Certainly that he's upset that he could have stopped the guy that killed him. But in Ultimate Spider-Man, because they're taking their time, those creators really have the chance to show that relationship, and so it's just a different kind of storytelling. And that deconstructed storytelling is pretty commonplace now. To your point that comics these days, individual issues are more or less chapters in a book that are because every writer and artist knows that the material is eventually going to be collected into trade paperbacks.
Yeah, and also like. In the old eras, like it felt much more sort of like mythic. You don't have much of the backstory of like a huge mythic character all the time, and so
yeah, and that's also partly the demographics of the audience. I think is the 60s comic book reader was a kid, and the 2000 comic book reader probably wasn't a kid, or certainly wasn't only kids. So.
Yeah.
And it's also that, I think what you're saying too is also the idea, I've heard it used when I was running my own comic company and we would sell the rights to our comic, try to get TV shows and movies made. The Hollywood folks would always use the term grounded. So this idea, you said, what made me think of that was you said mythic. Those early characters are very mythic, and they're larger than life. Even Spider-Man, who is the nerdy kid initially, very quickly becomes a figure who's larger than life. Certainly characters like Thor and Captain America, and these are all mythical creatures, but they become more grounded, I think, as Hollywood starts to enter the scene, and I think that's goes hand in glove with this a little bit as well, and how and why the Ultimates ultimately I think did have an influence on the Marvel Cinematic Universe is that it was arguably one of the first times that there were grounded versions of these mythical characters, right? So Captain America is, yes, he's still a World War II hero, and he's very heroic, but he also makes mistakes in the Ultimates. He ends up taking revenge on one of his teammates because of something horrible that teammate did. And Iron Man, who previously in the regular Marvel continuity had a drinking problem, in the Ultimates, that's even worse. Like he drinks to gain the courage to put on the Iron Man suit, because he's, this is a grounded version of that character who's smart enough to realize, hey, if I go put on this suit and go fight aliens, probably a pretty good chance I'm going to die, right? And so he deals with that with alcohol. And so, it's these, they are still mythical versions, but they're more grounded because they seem more like human beings as well, I guess is fair to say.
Yeah. And you talk about like how this is very much in the real world, and like even like celebrities get kind of folded in, like real celebrities and real countries, and
even so much so that because these are also not they're not considered superheroes. They're actually super soldiers. The Ultimates are in the comic books, in the early comic books at least, the Avengers were financed by Tony Stark, the Iron Man alter ego, and in the early Marvel comics, he's rich. I don't know if he's a billion. I don't know if they used the term billionaire back in the 60s, but certainly the equivalent of a billionaire. So he was the guy who financed the Avengers. But in the Ultimates, it's the U.S. government that's financing the Avengers. And that's a pretty big distinction. So they actually work for the U.S. government, and they are identified as super soldiers, not superheroes. And to your point about there being real people, Nick Fury, who's the person who oversees the Ultimates, he reports to President Bush. So George W. Bush. Yeah. And so it's not even a vague, U.S. president. They're specifically working for the U.S. government and specifically working for the real world's President Bush. And of course, these comics came out. The first issue came out not too long after the 9/11 attacks. So it was almost certainly created before the 9/11 attacks. But I don't think there's any way that a reader, when they pick this up in, December, January of 2001, early part of 2002, wouldn't have been thinking about the September 11 attacks, right? We all were, and anybody who was alive in December of 2001 was thinking about 9/11. And so this, it's not so much in issue one, because again, issue one's mostly a World War II story. But as the story goes along and it becomes very clear that they're working for the government, I don't think there's any way for the audience that was reading at that time not to be thinking about the fact, like, well, what would our world look like if we had superheroes instead of just soldiers, right? How would things be different? And so it's pretty, I think, pretty sophisticated storytelling, sophisticated ideas, for comics, certainly for superhero comics. There's lots of, things like Mouse and lots of important comics that have dealt with serious topics before. So it's not like it pioneered that, but for superhero comics, I think this is, and certainly in the Marvel universe, I think this is one that kind of took the material more seriously than it had been before. DC Comics, of course, had published Dark Knight Returns back in 1986. And they published Watchmen also, I think, in 1986. So they had been doing sort of serious, darker versions of their characters for quite some time, but it wasn't as common in the Marvel universe.
So you do sort of get into the end about how, like, kind of Ultimate has never really died, but like there's really two long or two, like, are they both 13 issue series? Like 13 issue series is really like the Ultimate's story, right? Yeah,
those are the ones that I deal with in this book principally, are the ones that are by Mark and Brian. And yes, you're right. There's the first one was called Ultimates, and then the second one was called Ultimates 2. And there was a couple of annuals in there, and then there was another series in the middle that was written in between Ultimates and Ultimates 2. There was another sort of like mini series that was done by a different creative team. But yeah, the Ultimates brand, this idea of rebooting the characters, that is something that Marvel has come back to, at least 3-4 times, including just in the last couple of years. They relaunched the Ultimate Universe very successfully. They're doing a version, I think, that's just wrapping up right now, where they did a new Ultimate Universe. And of course, well, 3-4 years from now, it would be surprising if they didn't do it yet again, right? So the rebooting. Yeah. This is also where the rebooting of characters kind of kicks off in a big way and becomes pretty commonplace.
Yeah, I just wanted to find this part because you point out that in 2011 they had the Ultimate Comics Universe Reborn, which had titles such as Ultimate Comics Spider-Man, Ultimate Comics X-Men, and Ultimate Comics The Ultimates. So just everything is ultimate.
They kind of, in my opinion, in that era, they kind of lost the plot of the idea that what Bill Jemas and Joe Quesada were trying to do, which was make comics that were accessible to a new reader. And they sort of lost the plot there at that point because, the titles became a little convoluted and confusing. So the first Ultimate Universe, the one that the one that I deal with, it ran for a long time. Ultimate Spider-Man ran for some crazy number of issues. I want to say like 150 issues. And Bendis and Bagley did it consecutively together for a huge run. I forget the exact number, but it's, if not the longest run for a creative team on a superhero book, it's certainly one of them. So successful. The line was unquestionably successful.
Yeah, certainly. Okay. I think we're going to wrap it up. Okay. I did have a weird question that I thought I would ask to sort of like bring it full circle. So what were the comics that you read as a kid that made you get interested in comics and made you want to get into this game?
Yeah, so I initially grew up reading Spider-Man. That was my favorite. My first comic was a Spider-Man comic, and I think like a lot of kids, like I was saying before, what initially Stan and Steve and then the other creators did with that Spider-Man character was, he was just accessible. He had real world problems. He kind of seemed like like somebody that you might know. So I love Spider-Man, and I love the costume. I was a little kid. I was probably my first comic I probably read when I was 6 or 7. And then as I grew up as a teenager, I was just really fortunate. I was in high school in the mid 80s, and that was just a really interesting time for comics. I mentioned, Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen. There were all these interesting independent publishers like First Comics and Eclipse Comics and Fantagraphics. And so the medium had become really vibrant in the 1980s in a way that I don't think really ever had before. Just all kinds of different genres. Love and Rockets was being published, and just I think it was a little before 8 Ball, but just really not just superhero comics, but just all kinds of interesting stories you could read. John Sable, which was about a mercenary. You could read American Flag, which was a science fiction comic, and just Concrete, about this guy that became basically encased in concrete. And so I just fell in love with comics, and I just got lucky that, when I graduated from college, I applied to work for a company called Eclipse Comics in 1990. And I got a job and ended up making that my career. I did go back to school and got an MBA. So I do have a business background, but ultimately I worked in publishing my entire life. I started a company called IDW, which went on to become a pretty big comic book publisher and is still around today. I left there in 2018 and then started another company called Clover Press. Both those companies, I should say, I founded. It wasn't just me that founded those companies. I founded them with some other folks as well. But I ran IDW for a long time, started Clover, and then, like I said, at the beginning, I kind of retired not too long ago. But I still love the medium, and honestly, I just love reading. It's not just comics. I read anything, and so I'm just a very much a lifelong reader who always, whenever I have free time, I always have a book in my hand. So.
Oh, nice. Well, you can definitely feel that in your book. The love for the medium, and certainly the love for the writing and the art in the Ultimates. So,
yeah, I actually didn't, and I really ended up. I didn't read these comics when they came out. I was busy running my own company at that point. I was certainly familiar with them, but I just didn't have the time to read a lot of superhero comics back then. And so when I sat down to read these, I really genuinely liked them. And these are. They are created by extraordinarily talented creators. The writer, the artist, the coloring. It's top notch.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for talking to me today. The Ultimates and Exploration, part of the Marvel Age of Comics series, it will be in the Skylight Books Arts Annex. This episode is dropping on the 14th, so it releases today. Get one, run right out, get it today. If you're listening to this and you're not in the LA area, get it from a lovely bookshop or your favorite book retailer where you are. Thanks again so much for being with us. Is there anything you want to plug at the end here?
No, I do. I fully support those. Support your independent bookstores, please. If you're in the San Diego area, my local bookstore is Camino Books. So go there. I don't know if I'll have it, to be honest, but
we'll special order it from them. Make them get copies.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks again, and have a great day.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Skylight Books podcast series. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to check out the book featured in this episode, or others, please visit skylightbooks.com. If you're in the Los Angeles area, stop by for one of our live in-person author events. You can find a calendar on our website. If you like this podcast, leave us a review. It really helps us out. Our music is by Duck the Piano Wire. Till next time.